Hi, everyone. As Crystal mentioned, my name is Robin, and I'm the Research Data Management Librarian at AU Library and Scholarly Resources. And I'm here to talk to you today about research data management. So just briefly, what we're going to go over in today's webinar is an introduction of what research data management is and its relationship to research culture and best practices for conducting research. From there, I'm going to move into discussing emerging requirements for research data management in the funding and publishing landscape, which are important things to be aware of as you're doing research. And then I'll go over some more specific considerations for how to create data management plans. And then we'll take a quick look at a data management planning tool, which will be useful as you move forward with research. Altogether, this presentation is intended to provide the beginnings of a research data management best practice toolkit that can be applied for different projects. I've included slides throughout that are titled Tools and Takeaways, and those slides contain links to resources, templates, and other tools you'll be able to use. And I will put a copy of my entire slide deck as well as that abbreviated Tools and Takeaways handout in the chat with a note that they'll also be linked from the recording when it's posted. And please feel free to post questions in the chat as we go. And then if you want to be able to raise your hand and speak, I'm going to suggest you hold that till the end of the presentation, just so that you're not captured in the recording for privacy purposes. Now, before I continue, I'm just going to put the slide deck links in the chat, as well as a link to the YouTube playlist where the rest of this series, including this recording, will be posted. Okay. So I want to start off here with a little bit of a warm-up activity. I'm going to throw a link in the chat to a Padlet, which is just kind of like an electronic wall for sticky notes. And ask that you share a little bit about your research context. Don't put any private information in the public-facing site, but things like, what type of program are you in? Does it have a research component? Are you going to do a thesis or a dissertation? Do you have to do a project? Do you have a research topic and any methods that you might have decided on? And do you have any tools you plan to use for your research or to manage your data? I'll give people a couple minutes to kind of think about that, but I'm also going to leave it open because it'll help me as I'm going through the presentation. And if you have any questions, to contextualize answers to your specific areas of study. Because the answer to every question otherwise always ends up being it depends, because it's important to do your data management planning for your specific project and your specific context. I'm just going to give people a moment here if you want to add a note to the Padlet about your research. And if you don't currently have a project, maybe a note about what you're interested in learning about research data from this presentation would be really helpful. And part of the purpose of having you think about this at the start is so that as I bring up different tips and tools as we go along, you can be thinking about how you might apply them in your own contexts. Okay. So that Padlet doesn't close. I'm just going to take it off screen so you can feel free to continue to fill it out or add other responses. And I'm going to continue on with the main content of the presentation here. So what is research data management? Research data management is a general term for how you plan for and carry out the handling of your data for your research project. So that's from the early planning stages through data gathering and generation into active analysis, and then into data deposit or any sort of long-term storage you may need to do for your data. So the life cycle of research data is shown on the screen here. You want to think about data management not just at the start or at the end of a project when you already have data, but throughout. So data management should be thought about and an initial plan should be drafted as your project is conceived of. So if you're doing a funding application or putting together a research proposal for your thesis, you want to start thinking about how you need to manage your data. During data collection, that plan can guide how you collect and document your data while you're actively using it. Where and how you store your data will then be important for you on your own project. For example, having backups to avoid loss, but also for you and to keep your work in compliance with any relevant ethical and legal requirements. So for example, if you're working with human participant data that has identifiers in it, that data may need to be kept confidential or removed from your data set. You also might have considerations if you have an industry partner or are working with proprietary data. After a project is completed, the data needs to be stored and preserved. So if you want to, or if you are working in an area where you are required to share your data, you want to plan for that from the start because it is much easier to share and reuse well-documented data that has been well formatted and been considered throughout your project than it is to try and do all of that work at the end, especially since large research projects may take place over the course of years. So good research data management is a part of doing rigorous research and contributes to a vibrant research culture. It can support open scholarship by documenting processes and making them more transparent so that data can be shared and reused. This is also in keeping with open access and open research movements motivated by the desire to make publicly funded research publicly accessible. Preserving data and making it accessible for reuse when possible is also a way of recognizing the funds and efforts involved in data collection and generation. So now when we think about best practices for research data management, there are some principles to consider. One key set of principles you'll hear talked about are the FAIR principles. The Go FAIR initiative promotes these principles, and they underlie research data management practices. So when you're planning and carrying out your data management, you want to consider how you can make your data fair. So FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. The idea being that if your data is the first way to be able to reuse and promote reuse of data is that it needs to be findable, easy to find for both people and computers. It should also be accessible. So if you can find the data, you also need to know how it can be accessed and if there's any authentication or authorization required. So some data sets are fully open and you can just reuse them, and others may have reuse conditions. Data should also be interoperable in that makes it easier for it to be integrated with other data. So in some fields, it's common to recombine existing data sets, and it's much more easy to do if they are able to interoperate with applications or workflows. And then data should be reusable. This is kind of an ultimate goal for the FAIR principles, to optimize reuse of data. So to achieve that, any data or metadata, which is data that describes the data, should be well written so that it can be replicated and combined in different settings. And I'm going to highlight here that the FAIR principles can be thought of as a continuum. Data can be more or less fair. It's not an all or nothing sort of approach. The idea is that the more fair you can make your data, the more reusable it will be. There are also the CARE and OCAP principles, and they're important and particularly relevant if you are working with Indigenous communities or data about Indigenous peoples or lands. So these principles support Indigenous data sovereignty. And the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance are maintained by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, and they include collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And now the principles of OCAP are Canadian and specific to First Nations context. They're maintained by the First Nations Information Governance Center. They include ownership, control, access, and possession. So principles like FAIR, CARE, and OCAP underlie good practice for research data management. And I'm hoping this presentation will encourage thinking about research data management as a collection of practices and concepts that can be applied or not as appropriate to any particular research project. Applying such best practices and data management planning has benefits for you as an individual researcher and for the wider research community. Now, I was seeing a hand up on my Teams window here. Good question. Would the term accessible also cover making the information accessible for people with disabilities? So from the direct definition, potentially, the FAIR principles tend to lean a little more into machine actionability than human readability, but accessibility is also an inclusivity and diversity consideration. And it would be important to think about audience free reuse and what's appropriate there. So that was a long way to say yes, you can include different types of accessibility and thinking about how you present and make your data available for reuse. Maximizing the accessibility is important, but it's also a labor-intensive process. Benefits and advantages of research data management. So some reasons that research data management is important and gaining growing prominence are that it can support the efficiency and organization of a researcher, research team, research project by standardizing ways data are collected and dealt with. So it can be useful to document your practices for your own and for any team members reference. So for example, if you're working as a research assistant on a project, it's helpful that the whole team understand what's being done. It can make personnel transitions easier, and it can also help you for keeping track of files over the course of a project and be very useful in communications back and forth with a supervisor if you're really properly documenting what you're doing. Research data management also supports increasing visibility and recognition for work with data. So if you plan for a data set to be preserved and made accessible in a repository, that also allows for that data to be cited and reused. And so when researchers reuse that data, you're getting credit for the initial creation of the data set. Research data management is also important on a larger scale by making a contribution to a movement towards open scholarship with the potential for reuse. It also can increase transparency by supporting replicability of studies. And the last thing I want to highlight here is that good RDM practice also helps for compliance with stakeholder policies. So funders have policies, institutions have policies, and individual publications you want to eventually publish that research in will also have policies that relate to data management, data retention, and data sharing. So you need to be aware of and plan for how you will comply with any policies that are relevant to you. And those might vary depending on what institution you're at, whether or not you have a funder that has additional requirements, and what type of journal you're publishing in, and whether or not they have their own requirements as well. So some takeaways from this section of the presentation are we have a library guide to research data management, which I will also throw the link for that in chat. And the Alliance the Research Data Management arm of the Digital Research Alliance of Canada has created training materials and has a library of previously created materials put together. Eugene Barsky from the University of British Columbia has also put together some very helpful guides, and I've put in links directly to the different sets of principles that were discussed. So now we're going to move into talking a bit about emerging research data management requirements. So like I said, institutions, publishers, funders, and associations at various levels may formally recognize the importance of good research data management and data sharing as a part of research culture through the provision of guidance and also adoption of formal policies. So this means that researchers have to be aware of the recommendations and requirements from various entities that could apply to their projects. In the Canadian context, the tri-agency councils, so that is SSHRC, NSERC, and CIHR, have a policy that is of particular importance. So this policy was released in March of 2021, and it has several requirements that are being phased in. Institutions had to put together strategies about how they would support their researchers in doing good data management. So AU's strategy was approved in May and is publicly posted online. And then more specifically for researchers, and I want to highlight here, this is for researchers receiving funding. The requirements aren't necessarily applying to scholarships at this point in time. But it's important from a grad student perspective to be aware of what the different requirements might be in the ecosystem if you're thinking about continuing on with research. So the requirements for researchers are data management plans. That's currently being piloted on certain funding calls, and data deposit, which the implementation of that will also be phased in, and the precise dates of that are still to be developed. But when they first posted the policy, they were thinking it would be post-March 2023, and we're still watching for announcements on that aspect of the policy. So a little more detail about these requirements. A data management plan is a document that describes how data will be collected, documented, formatted, protected, and preserved. It goes over how existing data sets will be used, what new data will be created over the course of a research project, whether and how data will be shared, and where data will be deposited. They encourage the use of standardized tools like DMP Assistant, which we'll get into a little later here. And then data deposit is required for all data, metadata, and code. They're suggesting it be put in a repository to ensure safe storage, curation, and preservation, and that access be provided where ethical, legal, and commercial requirements allow. And then, if possible, to also link this data with publications through persistent identifiers. So this is how tri-agency words these requirements. But good data management practices are important for any research project, whether or not it's subject to a particular funder's policies. So there are some other related policies and statements that have been put forward by tri-agency. So tri-agency previously had a statement of principles on good digital data management before the official policy came into place. And it includes things like responsibilities of researchers that arise from expectations around good documentation. So that includes using RDM best practices, developing data management plans that address the entire life cycle of a project, not just, say, the active portion of a project, but what are you doing with data long term, and following any applicable policies at your institutions or funders. I'm going to just quickly highlight here CIHR, which is the Canadian Institutes for Health Research and is one of the tri-agencies. They also have data management requirements that fall under the tri-agency open access policy, which was put into place in 2015. And that their particular requirements are that data sets must be kept for a minimum of 5 years after the end of a grant, whether the data is published or not, which is important for researchers to know. And then in various particular fields, such as bioinformatics, atomic and molecular coordinate data, anything using that type of data that's funded by them has to be deposited in an appropriate public database immediately upon publication of results. And they actually have a listing of suggested repositories for that. And lastly, SSHRC previously had a research data archiving policy, but everyone funded through them would now fall under the tri-agency policy. Now, when we get into journals and funders, publishers are beginning to have their own requirements around data dissemination. So many publishers now have what they call a data sharing policy or a requirement for a data availability or data publication statement. So I've got a couple of examples linked on the slide itself. Taylor and Francis has specific guidance on data availability statements for their journals. Sage also has its own guidance. So these type of statements explain where data associated with the research outcomes in a particular paper or journal article can be found and what conditions need to be met to access that data. So the statement may also include a link to the data set, particularly if the data has been deposited or otherwise made available in a repository or online. And some disciplines actually have what's called a data journal, where descriptions of data sets are published with links out to find the data. So there's a list of them on the slide here. So some takeaways from this section are links to the tri-agency statement of principles on digital data management, their research data management policy, and the open access policy on publications. And that last one also requires funded researchers to publish in open access journals. That policy is currently being evaluated and potentially revised by tri-agency. So now we're going to dive a little more specifically into data management planning. As I noted before, a data management plan needs to describe how data will be collected, documented, formatted, protected, and preserved. It's a living document you can update as needed and as your project evolves. So you may have a shorter plan at the start of your project that you lengthen or add more detail to as your project progresses. You may also have a shorter initial plan and then a lot more lab documentation or other documents that get into more detailed aspects about how data will be documented. It depends a bit on whether you're part of a team and what practices they have in place. For graduate students, that data management plan is also a way for you to work on planning your research project, and it's a tool you can share and use to communicate with your supervisor. So now I'm going to go over some general considerations for research data management that would be addressed in a data management plan before getting into how to use the DMP Assistant, which is a tool that has templates to help you create data management plans. So ethics and research data management. If you want to or are required to share your data, you need to plan for that from the start. And if you have human participants, they need to be notified and consent to data being released. This is typically done on a consent form when participants consent to participate in your study. And I'm going to highlight here the TCPS2, so the Tri-Council Policy Statement on the Ethical Conduct of Research, was updated at the end of 2022 and released at the start of 2023. It now has a new section on the broad consent for storage of data and human biological materials for future unspecified research. It's an important section to look at if you're planning to share your data, because it goes over things that an ethics board is going to look at in your application if you want to share your data. It doesn't mean you can't share it. It just means that you need to think out the implications of doing so and how to appropriately address it. So how you intend to use the data and whether or not it can be reused, deposited, or shared is determined by language in your information letter and consent documents approved by your research ethics board. So if you don't plan for it early on, you may have to go through additional consent processes later. So for ethics and sensitive data, there are some additional helpful tools. I've included a link to the current TCPS2, and then also some links to Portage's sensitive data tools. So Portage has now been renamed to a subset of the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, but all these documents that are linked out to still have the Portage branding. So there's a glossary of terms that people use related to sensitive data, a human participant research data risk matrix, which is intended to help you as a researcher determine the risk level and make decisions about data management and appropriate access. And the one I really want to highlight here is a document with samples of research data management language for the informed consent forms. So it's not intended that you're going to copy and paste the language out of the document, but you can take the suggestions there and adapt them to your particular study. There was also some de-identification guidance created specific to COVID-19, but it has some good resources in general in it. Now for data storage and documentation. You want to be planning for how you will collect, store, and analyze your data. You need to consider data security and any ethics requirements you have. So you want to document any data collection protocols, when and how data will be migrated from collection devices to storage, who is going to do so, how will they get access to those systems, how are you going to name your files and folders, do you need any appropriate privacy or security measures in place? All this can be recorded in a data management plan or in lab or research team documentation. And README files that detail this information, particularly around file storage and naming, can be stored right with the data as a reminder of how you name the files and how you organize them. Because if you collected your data and then spend a couple of years on the analysis and go back, it's helpful to have used a consistent system throughout. So for file naming, you want to be descriptive and consistent. Develop and record any conventions for naming and storage, and folder structures can be outlined in that README file. So I have created some worksheets to help with thinking about systematic naming conventions and for creating READMEs, and they're linked in the takeaways for this section. So things to consider are, do you have a project name or acronym for the project you want to include in your file names? Is location or spatial coordinates important to record? Do you need to record the researcher name or team member who collected the data in the file name? Is there a date or date range associated with it? Are you collecting data that has multiple types? So for example, are you doing an interview that's going to be recorded and then transcribed? So you want to track which type of data it is in the file name. Are there other conditions that are relevant? And do you need to include version numbers? You also want to remember to avoid using special characters. Not all operating systems recognize them. You want to not use spaces. So the examples here are to use underscores, or to use camel case, where you capitalize new words. And use year, month, day format. This is the more this is machine readable. I prefer this one because it's also human readable. And then again, use some form of version control. So I've got an example that's floating in on the slide here where my naming convention is the date of collection, the group code where I've given each group a floral pseudonym, and then the data type. So this particular study had audio recordings as backup. They had webcam video recordings, and then there were transcripts of those recordings. So all of that is captured in the file names for future reference. This slide is an example of a README that I borrowed from Kristen Briney. So this is a plain text file you'd include in the top level folder for your project that explains how you're sorting things out. So it gives the project name, its date, a brief description of what the project would be, and whether or not it's funded. You might also include what your supervisor's name is. And then you want to talk about how you're organizing the file. So for this study, she's got raw data in one file, analyzed data in another file, a file for paper drafts for her actual write-ups of results, and a file for documentation for any other research notes and things that she's not considering data. So this is a quick example. You might have more or less documentation in an actual README, depending on the complexity of your data collection mechanisms. I'm going to get a little more into details about storage types. There are different types of electronic storage for data. Networked drives or storage devices, for example, a storage server or network attached storage device accessed through a network connection, so a local area network. Some institutions may provide access to these for research purposes, and then they're accessed through a virtual proxy network. A lot of people will be more familiar now with cloud storage, which is a distributed remote storage solution through which you can upload and access your data from anywhere with an internet connection. So common examples include Dropbox, Google Drive, and Microsoft OneDrive. Whether or not you want to use those services for your research data if you have sensitive data concerns is another question, though. And portable storage media are devices you can connect to your computer to save your data to. So that's like a USB key, an external hard drive, a CD, a DVD. And of course, your computer's own hard drive. It is a good idea to encrypt both your computer's hard drive and any portable storage media. And that is something that is common for a research ethics board to ask you to do if you haven't noted it in your existing application. So now, a lot of cloud-based services are accessed through service providers. So there are some additional considerations you want to ensure you're looking at in these cases. You want to consider the terms of service for the product and whether or not they meet your needs for security and confidentiality. So remember that cloud services use distributed data centers. Those data centers might be outside of your country of residence, and data stored on them could be subject to laws of those jurisdictions. You want to check how the provider secures data. Is it encrypted at rest to protect from hackers and data breaches? And is it encrypted in transit to protect it while it is being uploaded or downloaded from the service? You also want to look on their policies on data use. Some companies use the data you input into their system to improve their products, train their algorithms. If you have assured participants on consent documents that the data will only be used for research purposes by your research team, you can't then use a service that says they can use the data to improve their commercial product. You have to be careful about how you lay out your consent and what service providers you choose as a result. Discussing data security, encryption, and backup options with your local IT department is a good idea because they're equipped to speak to all of the technical aspects in a way that many people aren't in general. So they may be able to look at talk about whether provider is using a recognized security standard, or they may be able to talk about whether or not your institution has an enterprise contract that's gone through a security and privacy review. So they may allow data to go on a service that in general someone else might not want to use if they have a free account. And I also want to note here the Digital Research Alliance of Canada has research computing services. They used to be called Compute Canada. Researchers at Canadian institutions can get set up on their services. Just as a note here for graduate students, your supervisor typically needs to sponsor you to get an account in that case. And I see a question in the chat, can reference managers be used for storage or in vivo? I'm going to come back to that one at the end. The answer is yes, although with in vivo, you've got to look at where the storage is, and same for the reference managers. It depends a bit on the type of data and project. So I'm going to flag that and come back to it. And lastly, here I've got backups highlighted on its own slide because it's important to think about whether or not the system you're using is creating backups, whether you need to create backups yourself, and where those backups are being stored. So a general recommendation is the 3-2-1 rule, to have 3 copies of your data in 2 different locations and more than one type of storage media. You want to periodically check that any backups you have are working properly and haven't become corrupted. And if you're using computers provided by AU, they do backups, so you want to consult with IT about what gets backed up. And you want to ensure you understand how any cloud service provider you're using works. So a lot of them by default, because this is the benefit of the cloud, are keeping distributed copies at different data centers, which is helping you meet your different locations requirement here. But they may also, if you delete it in one place, delete everywhere. So they may or may not have protections for user error. You could still accidentally delete all of your copies. So if you're using a provider, you may want to have multiple copies on them, or think about having another external copy elsewhere. That can vary by project and data type, but it's just an important thing to consider. So some tools and resources here. We've got a file naming advice in our library guide, and then a worksheet for file naming. The Research Data Alliance has put together a metadata standards catalog. This is useful if you're working in a discipline that has kind of common data types collected and ways of describing that data that are commonly used within a discipline. There may be an actual standard for that, so that's something to look up and be aware of. For README templates, the Federated Research Data Repository has a template. Cornell has put together an openly licensed template, which I actually adapted for the README template that I've posted as well. And I've also put a link to what used to be Compute Canada here for anyone interested in getting access to their services, because they also have advanced research computing. It's not just for storage. Now I'm going to dive a little into data deposit here. So this was the kind of second requirement coming out of that tri-agency policy. It also speaks towards more of the end stages of a project, in the sense of you're not actively working with the data anymore. You're thinking about how you're going to store it longer term, whether or not you're going to share it. So planning for that deposit and sharing needs to be carefully thought out. You may want to deposit your data in an actual repository. I've got 3 types listed here on the slide. A disciplinary repository is a repository that takes particular types of data generated in a discipline. They're usually well established and are a good first choice because your data will be more likely to be found by other people in your field. There are also institutional repositories that are maintained often by a university or college's library. Athabasca does not currently have a repository, but we're working towards launching one very soon. And then generalist repositories are non-discipline specific. They typically will take data of any type. So the Federated Research Data Repository in Canada is a good option, and they specifically target medium to large data sets with a default storage allocation of 1 terabyte. The idea there being that institutional repositories will probably take smaller data sets, and then the Burger would take larger data sets. So when you're selecting a repository, you want to think about the fit for your project and discipline. So are other researchers who you want to find your data going to be able to find it there? Does it take the appropriate data types that you're looking for? You also want to look at curation. So some places will actually have curators on staff and criteria that your data needs to meet before they will accept your deposit. Those curators can then work with you to help make your data more fair. Persistent identifiers are an important aspect of data deposit. So most repositories should provide you with some sort of identifier, like a DOI or digital object identifier. Those make your data easier to find and cite. And that's something you definitely want to check in advance, whether or not the repository will issue you that persistent identifier, because some journals now require that you give them that DOI as a part of publishing. So you may need that in order to get published in your journal of choice. And then preservation. Not all repositories are intended for long-term preservation, so you want to know if they have any established commitment to preserve your data for a specific period of time. And that time period may be determined based on continued value of the data set. And some repositories may be certified. Particular standards include the Core Trust Seal, Trustworthy Data Repository Requirement, and the Trusted Digital Repository designation. Within Canada, not all data repositories have achieved this type of certification yet, so it's kind of a caveat there. It's something to look for, but it doesn't necessarily mean you can't use the repository. You want to really think first and foremost about the fit for your project and discipline. So some takeaway tools and resources for the data deposit section are a link to the Federated Research Data Repository, the Registry of Research Data Repositories, which is a place where that maintains records of repositories, so you can search through to see if you can find a repository relevant to your data. And then Portage put together some recommended repositories for COVID-19 data specifically. So I'm just going to pause here briefly because we're going to jump into looking at creating a data management plan and what's involved. And I'm going to need to swap windows. So we're going to look at DMP Assistant, which is a tool that contains templates and some guidance for creating data management plans. I'm going to throw a link to DMP Assistant in the chat. And then I'm going to drag my window over here to DMP Assistant. So DMP Assistant has just been rebranded in this month. So if you have been on it before, it used to be blue. It is now matching the Alliance kind of gold yellow colors. You can create an account here. It just requires your name and an email address. If you put in your organizational affiliation, so Athabasca University, that can enable additional features. So for us, it means I have enabled on the back end a request feedback button. So you'd be able to hit that to send an email to the library to have our staff look at your data management plan and provide some feedback. Other organizations may have also added in customized templates they prefer people to use. So if your organization is there, it's a good idea to put it in. I'm just going to sign in to my account. Hopefully, I always type the password wrong when people are watching. There we go. Okay, so some features in here I'm going to give you a quick overview of. You have a dashboard which lists all of your plans. There are some links at the top that'll take you back out to if you've set your, and I should note, this is what it'll look like if you set your affiliation as Athabasca University. So there will be links back out to our library's homepage, our library's research data management guide, and to a general email that'll get you in touch with the library. If you create a plan, give it a title. I'm going to make this sample plan. I think I'm up to 7 now here. I'm going to mark this off as a mock project. If you're doing it for an actual project, you would leave that blank. This feature is largely for statistics purposes on our end. We'd like to be able to see how many, we can't see your plans in the system, but on our side, we can see how many plans have been created so that we can assess our service offering. So checking that box just lets us know whether it's for a real project or a fake project. And then I'm going to put in Athabasca University here. And then there'll be a drop-down list of templates that you can use. You can use any one that makes the most sense for your research. Because we're doing a general non-discipline specific presentation here, I'm going to choose the Portage template, which is an awkward name, but it's the generic template. So Portage is the body that originally hosted the Data Management Planning Assistant in Canada. And so this was their initial template here. When I hit Create Plan, a new page opens up that has a place for me to put in a bit of basic information about my project. So a brief description or abstract, the research domain, any dates and other identifiers related to the project. You can add in contributors information if you want to, but I'm going to focus here on the plan overview and write plan tabs, as well as the request feedback tab. So the plan overview tab will give a list of all of the questions being asked in a particular template. And then the write plan tab in this template is just one. Some templates are phased, so you'd actually see the names of the phases as tabs instead of just a write plan tab. When I jump in here, I can see the different sections available in this template. So if I want to open the data collection section, I have a box where I can answer each of the 3 questions in that section. There's some general guidance about what's being looked for in the answer. So for what types of data will you collect, create, link to, acquire, or record? They give examples. Is it numeric data? Is it images? Is it spatial data? There's also a box for comments, which can be used if you were to share this with your supervisor. They might provide comments here. If you were to request feedback from the library, I would also provide comments here rather than touching any of your answers in the boxes. Some templates will also have sample answers underneath here. If you choose any of the more specific ones, that's typically where they might have some additional answers. And some of the guidance is longer in those more specific templates. So from here, I'm going to jump over to the sharing tab is a spot where you can add people in. So you might make your supervisor a co-owner or an editor, or just read-only access if you want them to only edit comments. And then on the request feedback tab, if you hit this button, it's going to email the library and they'll get a notification so that we can review and add some comments, suggestions. If you prefer, you can create an appointment with us to go over some of your questions. And the last tab here is the download tab, which could be useful if, for example, your supervisor doesn't have an account, doesn't want to create one, or if you need to download it out to submit it to, say, your examining committee, or if you want to submit it to a scholarship or funding application, you could download things out as a PDF or Word document format. So if you answer no questions and then select the document format and download it, you would get a Word document with just the list of questions if you prefer to work there versus in an online in-browser platform. So from here, I'm going to take away that window and come back to my presentation. So some additional tools and resources for data management plans are DMP examples. These have been put together by an expert group of the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, previously Portage, where they have examples from digital humanities, mixed methods, natural sciences, and social sciences. I've linked them all in the slides here. And then there are also these links to the templates. There are a couple different ways you can view them. If you open up a new one in DMP Assistant itself, you get the sort of fill-in boxes like I just showed. If you use these links, they take you to a PDF version that has the guidance and sample answers all in the PDF. So it can be helpful if you don't want to create a bunch of new plans to just look at the templates, you can go into these PDF versions and take a look and decide what makes the most sense for you. Okay, so I'm just flipping back to our research activity here, where if you want to think about your own context, are there any tools or tips from today or other tools and tips you want to try or share? So I'm going to let you think about that and open things up for questions and sharing of tips, either in the Padlet, in the chat, and I'll put the Padlet link back in case people close their windows. So think about tools or tips you want to try or share. And then my next slide here is any questions you might have. So if you want to follow up, you can email me. I've got a link to the library guide, a QR code here for an appointment, and I'll put all of these links in the chat. And also because I know AU has an agreement with Memorial University where students can attend each other's professional development sessions. If anyone here is from Memorial, you can also reach out to Allison Farrell. She provided me with her email and gave me permission to share it here, and I've included a link to Memorial's Research Data Management Guide as well.